When engineers had 48 hours to save an army, this timber bridge did it. It is December 23rd, 1944, the frozen, fog-shrouded forests of the Ardennes. For 1 week, the German Wehrmacht's desperate surprise offensive, Operation Wacht am Rhein, has punched deep into Allied lines, creating the deadly protrusion history would call the Bulge. At its tip, the spearhead of the German 5th Panzer Army grinds toward the Meuse River, the last natural barrier protecting the vital Allied port of Antwerp. But in this vast, chaotic battlefield, a different drama, one of salvation, not assault, is unfolding near the small Belgian town of Dinant. Here, the U.S. First Army, with elements of the British XXX Corps, is in perilous retreat, its lines of communication severed. Tens of thousands of men, along with their vehicles, armor, and hope, are funneling toward a single catastrophic bottleneck: the wrecked and hopelessly congested bridges over the Meuse. An entire army risks being trapped against the icy riverbank, vulnerable to annihilation from the air and the pursuing panzers. Their only chance: a miracle of military engineering. And for that miracle, the order came down to a single unit. They had 48 hours. The burden of this impossible task fell on the men of the 1058th Engineer, Port Construction and Repair Group, reinforced by detachments from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion and supported by British Royal Engineers. Leading them was Lieutenant Colonel William Carter, a seasoned, no-nonsense officer who had cut his teeth on the logistical nightmares of the Normandy landings. His command was a mix of hardened veterans and young specialists, men who were more accustomed to building docks and repairing harbors than frontline combat engineering under direct threat. The strategic situation was dire. The main highway bridges at Dinant and Givet were either destroyed by earlier retreating forces or were under constant artillery and aerial attack, their approaches choked with a desperate tangle of trucks, ambulances, jeeps, and horse-drawn carts from shattered units. Every minute, the backlog grew. Every minute, the German vanguard, elements of the 2nd Panzer Division and the Panzer Lehr, drew closer, their reconnaissance probes now within a few miles. The order from Supreme Headquarters was unequivocal: establish a new high-capacity crossing away from the primary targets to facilitate the rapid withdrawal and reorganization of Allied forces. The designated site was a relatively quiet stretch of the Meuse near the hamlet of Ux. The parameters were staggering. The bridge had to support 40-ton tanks, withstand the punishing current of the rain-swollen Meuse, and be constructed from scratch in the heart of the European winter. The clock started ticking at 6 o'clock hours, December 24th. Christmas Eve. Colonel Carter's initial reconnaissance was a gut punch. The chosen site offered advantages: decent approach roads on the western bank and some concealment from a low ridgeline. But the challenges were monumental. The river was nearly 300 feet wide at this point, running fast and clogged with jagged ice flows. The eastern bank was steep and muddy, a killing ground if German infantry arrived during construction. They had zero heavy construction equipment. Everything had to be done by hand, winch, and sheer muscle. The plan was audacious: a heavy timber trestle bridge, a design rooted in centuries-old principles but scaled for modern, mechanized war. The 1058's lumberjacks and carpenters would become the Army's saviors. Working parties were immediately dispatched to nearby forests, now eerily quiet but potentially harboring German scouts. The whine of chainsaws broke the winter silence as teams, working in rotating shifts under the guard of combat engineers from the 291st, began felling mature pine and oak trees. Other teams, waist-deep in the freezing water, began driving the first wooden pilings into the riverbed, using a makeshift pile driver operated by a winch mounted on a truck. The cold was paralyzing. Men had to be pulled from the water every 20 minutes to avoid fatal hypothermia. By 1400 hours on the 24th, the first skeletal bents, the vertical support frames, were rising from the murky water. But so too was the threat. At 1520, the sharp crack of a sniper's rifle echoed across the river. A sapper from the 291st slumped over his winch. The immediate perimeter was secured, but the message was clear: the Germans knew something was happening. Later that evening, a flight of German Focke-Wulf 190 fighter bombers, likely searching for the main crossings, passed overhead. The work froze. men pressing themselves into the mud and timber. The aircraft banked and disappeared toward Dinant. It was a temporary reprieve. Christmas Day dawned not with celebration, but with a grim, frost-rimed determination. The engineers, fueled by cold coffee and the knowledge that thousands depended on them, worked in a frenzy. Hammers rang on spikes. Great beams, shaped by adze and saw, were swung into position by creaking block and tackle. The bridge began to take shape, a crude but beautiful lattice of raw timber reaching from the western bank like a lifeline. But at 1100 hours, the situation escalated. Forward observers reported contact with German armored cars only 5 miles to the east. The distant muffled thump of artillery fire became a near-constant background noise. The combat engineers laid defensive minefields on the eastern approaches and set up machine gun nests. The builders were now building under the direct shadow of combat. By the afternoon of the 25th, the bridge was two-thirds complete, but nature and war conspired to halt it entirely. A sudden, violent snow squall swept through the valley, reducing visibility to zero and coating the treacherous, half-finished deck in a layer of slick ice. Work became impossibly dangerous. Men slipped from beams, only saved by safety lines. The temperature plummeted further, numbing hands and making the handling of cold steel tools agony. Then at 16:30 hours, catastrophe struck. A groaning, grinding sound cut through the storm. A critical central piling, undermined by the fierce current in the weight of ice, began to list. Before emergency braces could be secured, with a sickening crack of splintering timber, the entire bent collapsed sideways into the river. It took a fully completed 80-foot section of the deck with it. The wreckage created a dam of debris, causing the water to surge and threaten the adjacent supports. A profound despair settled over the site. Over 36 hours of backbreaking labor now lay in ruins in the freezing water. Colonel Carter gathered his exhausted, frost-bitten officers. The German pressure was intensifying. They could not afford to start anew. Radio reports confirmed the main highways were now under direct artillery fire. The Army's retreat was slowing, turning into a potential rout. If the bridge wasn't finished, the alternative was a Dunkirk-like disaster on the banks of the Meuse. But in winter, and against a relentless enemy, the engineers stared at the wreckage. The clock read 1700 hours on December 25th. They had less than 12 hours to complete a task that now seemed physically impossible. The fate of an army literally hung on the next decision. It was a master sergeant, a grizzled Montana logger named John McAllister, who broke the silence. Shouting over the wind, he pointed not at the wreckage, but at the standing structure on the far bank. "We don't fix it, Colonel. We bypass it. We turn this into a flying bridge on this side." His idea was a stroke of desperate genius. They would abandon efforts to salvage the collapsed section. Instead, they would dismantle the last 100 feet of completed bridge on the western side and use those precious, pre-fitted timbers to construct a new, narrower spur from the eastern bank, angling it to meet the stable, central section at a strong joint. It was a hybrid solution, part fixed bridge, part tactical improvisation. It would create a dogleg, slowing traffic, but it would work. Carter instantly approved. What followed was a blur of superhuman effort. Pause. Working under blinding generator-powered lights that made them silhouettes against the snow. A tremendous risk. The engineers became a single organism. Teams swarmed over the western structure, carefully despiking and lowering beams. Swimmers, tethered with ropes, guided them across the gap in the current. Eastern spur, carpenters worked like men possessed, notching and securing the relocated timber. The cold was so intense that metal fused to skin, until they dropped, were revived with scalding soup, and went back in. They were no longer building a bridge. They were fighting for the lives of their comrades. By 0400 hours on December 26th, the final connection was made. The last 12-inch oak plank was spiked into place. There was no cheer, only a hollow, exhausted silence. The bridge stood, uneven, crude, but intact. At that exact moment, as if on cue, the first elements of a retreating armored column appeared on the western bluff. The battered remnants of the U.S. 7th Armored Division's CCB, with a handful of surviving Shermans and a long column of trucks filled with hollow-eyed infantry. The lead tank commander, upon seeing the wooden structure, radioed back in disbelief. The order was given, cross.